The door of the schoolhouse swung open so hard it cracked against the interior wall, and every child in Eva Ford's classroom spun around in their seats with wide, startled eyes. Eva herself was at the chalkboard, her hand frozen mid-letter, the white dust of chalk still suspended in the air around her fingers. The man who stepped across the threshold was not a parent. He was not a town official. He was not anyone who had any business walking through that door with a Colt revolver on each hip and blood drying on the left shoulder of his duster coat. He was Jonas Morgan, and every soul in Redemption, Texas, knew exactly what that name meant. The children pressed back against their wooden benches. Little Tommy Greer let out a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. Eva did not move. She held the chalk so tightly in her fingers that she felt it crumble at the tip, and she stared at Jonas Morgan the way a person stares at a thundercloud rolling in over flat plains when there is nowhere left to run. He looked at her, not at the children, not at the room. He looked at her, and something in his face was so raw, so utterly stripped of its famous cold armor, that Eva felt the breath leave her body. "Miss Ford," he said, and his voice came out low and hoarse, like a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally set it down in the wrong place at the wrong time. "I need you to know something." She found her voice before she found her composure. "This is a classroom, Mr. Morgan. There are children here." "I know that." He pulled his hat from his head. The gesture was startlingly gentle, at odds with everything Eva had ever heard whispered about Jonas Morgan in the general store, at the church steps, across the supper tables of Redemption. He held the hat in both hands, turning the brim slowly, and he looked at the floor between them as though measuring the distance. Then he looked up, and his dark eyes caught hers with a force that felt almost physical. "I'm done," he said. "I'm done with the life I have led, every piece of it, every last dark corner of it, and I did not know where else to go." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Eva had ever heard. She drew herself up to her full height, which was not impressive but which carried a dignity she had fought hard to earn in a town that had not always made things easy for a woman alone. She turned to her students. Her voice was perfectly steady when she spoke. "Class is dismissed for the afternoon. Gather your things quietly and go directly home. Do not dawdle in the street." The children moved like startled birds, collecting their primers and slates, filing past Jonas Morgan with their chins tucked and their eyes cutting sideways at him. He stepped aside and let them pass, pressing himself against the door frame, making himself as unthreatening as a man of his reputation could possibly make himself. When the last child, young Rosie Callahan, scurried through the doorway, Eva walked calmly across the room and pushed the door closed. She turned to face him. This is where her story truly began. Not in that moment of breathless confrontation, but in the weeks and months that had built, brick by terrible brick, toward it. Eva Ford had arrived in Redemption, Texas, in March of 1882, stepping off the stagecoach from Austin with 2 trunks, a teaching certificate issued by the state, and a quiet grief she wore like a second skin. She was 26 years old, and she had left behind a life that had collapsed so completely and so suddenly that the wreckage of it still sometimes woke her in the night. Her father had died of fever the previous autumn, leaving debts that swallowed the family home whole. Her engagement to a man named Richard Hale had dissolved within a fortnight of her father's death, Richard having decided with remarkable speed that a woman without property or prospects was not the woman he had agreed to marry. The schoolteacher position in Redemption had appeared in the Austin newspaper like a lifeline thrown across dark water, and Eva had grabbed it with both hands. Redemption was a cattle town, sun-bleached and dry, squatting in the middle of open rangeland 60 miles south of the Oklahoma border. It had a main street of packed dirt flanked by a general store, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, a saloon called the Copper Spur, and a scattering of wood frame buildings that leaned into one another like tired men at the end of a long day. The schoolhouse sat at the east end of town, separate from everything else, small and earnest, with 12 children enrolled when Eva arrived and 15 by summer. She had loved it almost immediately. The work, the children. The particular satisfaction of watching a child's face change, when something that had been dark suddenly went bright with understanding. She had not loved the loneliness, but she had made her peace with it, the way a person learns to make peace with a bad knee or a drafty window, accommodating it into the daily routine of living. She had first heard Jonas Morgan's name from Hattie Greer, Tommy's mother, who ran the town's only boarding house, and who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of regional history and gossip that she dispensed with equal enthusiasm. "You'll hear things about Jonas Morgan," Hattie had told Eva one evening in April, setting a cup of black coffee on the kitchen table between them. "Living out at the Callaway Ranch while he does some work for them. Man has a reputation that would curl your hair." What kind of reputation? Eva had asked, mostly to be polite. Hattie had counted items off on her fingers. Bounty hunting, gunfighting, hired pistol work for cattle barons in land disputes that turned bloody. They say he rode with the Dalton crew for a year before he broke with them, though nobody's certain why. He's brought in a dozen men wanted by the law and buried twice that many who did not cooperate. The marshal over in Cimarron City says Jonas Morgan is one of the most dangerous men alive west of the Mississippi. Eva had absorbed this information and decided it had nothing to do with her. She was a schoolteacher. Jonas Morgan was a hired gun. Their worlds had no logical intersection. She had been wrong. The first time she actually saw him was in the general store in early May. She was purchasing chalk and copybooks when the bell above the door announced a new customer, and she had looked up from the counter to find the most unsettling pair of dark eyes she had ever encountered studying her, with an expression she could not immediately classify. He was tall, lean in the way that suggested hard living rather than deprivation, with a jaw that carried several days of dark stubble and hands that were scarred at the knuckles. He wore his guns low on his hips, tied down in the manner of a man who used them professionally, and his duster was dusty from long travel. He nodded at her. She nodded back. She paid for her supplies and left, but she thought about those eyes for 3 days afterward, which irritated her considerably. The second meeting was accidental and more significant. It was an evening in late May, and Eva was walking back from the Callahan farm where she had been tutoring young Rosie in arithmetic. The road between the farm and town passed through a stretch of open ground near the dry bed of a creek, and it was there, in the orange light of a setting sun, that she came across Jonas Morgan crouched in the dirt examining something on the ground. She almost turned back. Then professional curiosity, and she later admitted to herself, something more complicated than curiosity, kept her feet moving forward. He heard her boots on the packed earth and rose, his hand dropping to his gun before he had fully turned, and then he froze when he saw it was only her. "Sorry," he said. "Reflex." "What are you looking at?" she asked. He hesitated, and then he stepped aside and showed her. On the ground, sheltered in a hollow of dry grass, was a coyote pup, impossibly small, one leg bent at an angle that spoke of injury. It was watching them both with amber eyes full of wild terror. "Found it about 20 minutes ago," Jonas said. "Mother's not coming back. Something got to her." Eva crouched down and studied the pup. "Its leg is broken." "I can see that. Can you set it?" He looked at her with an expression she would come to recognize as his version of surprise, which was very subtle, a slight widening of the eyes, a fractional shift in the set of his jaw. "Set a coyote's leg." "Why not, if you know how?" "I know how," he said slowly, "if you can keep it still." They had spent 40 minutes in the fading light working together, Eva holding the terrified creature wrapped in her shawl while Jonas, with those scarred hands moving with a gentleness that entirely contradicted his reputation, fashioned a splint from 2 straight sticks and a strip of cloth torn from his shirt. The pup bit Eva once on the thumb. She did not cry out. Jonas glanced at her when it happened, and something shifted in his expression that she could not name. When it was done, they released the pup into the brush where it would have a chance. They stood in the near dark, and Jonas said, "You're not afraid of much, are you?" It was not quite a question. "I am afraid of a great deal," Eva replied. "I have simply learned that fear is not always a reliable guide to whether something is worth doing." He had looked at her for a long moment, and then he had said, "I'm Jonas Morgan." "I know who you are," she said. "I'm Eva Ford." "I know who you are too," he said. She had walked back to town alone, and she had lain awake that night thinking about a man who could kill a person at 50 yards and use those same hands to set the broken leg of a frightened wild creature in the dying light of a Texas evening. The weeks that followed had a quality that Eva found difficult to describe, even to herself. He began appearing at the edges of her world with a regularity that felt deliberate without being intrusive. She would look up from her yard where she was beating dust from a rug and see him riding past on the road, and he would tip his hat. She would be leaving the church after Sunday services, and he would be leaning against the post of the general store across the street, and he would nod, and she would nod, and they would both go on their separate ways with something unspoken hanging in the warm air between them. They began talking in earnest on a Sunday afternoon in June, when they happened to reach the general store at the same moment, and, in the awkwardness of the narrow doorway, he stepped aside for her, and she thanked him, and he followed her in, and somehow they were both at the counter at the same time, and the conversation about the weight of the new shipment of flour turned into a conversation about the dryness of the season, which turned into a conversation about where they had each come from, which turned into them sitting on the bench outside the store for 2 hours while the afternoon burned around them, talking the way people do when they have each been very quiet for a very long time, and suddenly find a person they are willing to be less quiet with. She learned things about him that surprised her. He had been raised in Missouri, the son of a Methodist preacher who died when Jonas was 14. Leaving him and his younger sister Cora in the care of an uncle who had no warmth to give and a great deal of unpleasantness to dispense instead. He had left at 16 with a horse that wasn't technically his, and the understanding that the world would not simply give him anything. He had drifted west. He had fallen in with men who taught him what he knew about guns, and he had discovered that he was very good at it in the cold, mechanical way that a person can be good at something they did not choose and cannot fully escape. "There's money in it," he said simply, "and I knew how to not die, which matters in that line of work." "Did you ever want to do something else?" Eva asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I used to read, when I was young. My father's books. I could read before I could ride. I used to think about teaching." She had stared at him. He had looked away with the self-consciousness of a man who has said something true in public for the first time in a long while. "That does not seem accidental," Eva said carefully. "That of all the towns in Texas, you end up in one with a schoolhouse." He had looked back at her then, and there it was again, that thing in his eyes that she had no name for yet. "No," he said, "I don't suppose it does." July was the hottest month Eva had ever endured. The plains baked, the air shimmered with heat, and the dust got into everything. She taught her lessons with the school's 2 windows propped open and her students fanning themselves with their primers. She came home each evening to the small house the town provided for the schoolteacher, pressed a damp cloth to her face, and read until the heat broke enough to sleep. Jonas had begun visiting. Not in the evenings, not in any way that would have been considered improper by the women of the town who already watched their conversations with narrowed eyes. He came on Saturday afternoons when Eva was working in her small yard or marking papers on her porch, and they would sit and talk for hours. He had a dry, unexpected wit that she found disarming. He had opinions about books she had read, which delighted her, because finding anyone in Redemption who had read widely was rare, and finding a man who had read both Dickens and a technical manual on frontier medicine, and could discuss both with equal clarity was remarkable. She told him about her father, and he listened in the attentive, unhurried way that she was coming to understand was simply how he did things when he was fully present. She told him about Richard Hale and the engagement, keeping her tone matter-of-fact, and Jonas's jaw had tightened in a way she pretended not to notice, and which warmed something in her chest against her better judgment. He told her gradually in pieces about some of the things he had done. He did not romanticize them, and he did not hide from them. He spoke about the men he had brought in for bounties, some of whom deserved it, and some of whom he was less certain about in the long, quiet hours of the night. He spoke about 2 land disputes in New Mexico that had turned into range wars, and his part in them, and the way those things sat with him now. He spoke about his sister Cora, who had married a farmer in Kansas and had 3 children, and wrote him letters that he kept in the inside pocket of his duster, even though they were crumpled and worn from handling. "She wants you to come home," Eva said, reading this between his words. "She wants me to stop," he said. "She writes it outright sometimes. She says she prays every night that I'll decide to stop before the decision is made for me." "Is that a possibility, the decision being made for you?" He met her eyes without flinching. "In this line of work, it's always a possibility." She had thought about that for a long time after he left that evening, sitting on her porch as the stars appeared one by one in the wide Texas sky. Feeling something she did not entirely want to feel for a man whose life was constructed so entirely of danger and darkness, and choices she could not sanction. The complication arrived at the end of July in the form of a man named Dale Cutter. Dale Cutter was the segundo, the second in command, of a cattle operation called the Rocking H Ranch, which was one of the largest spreads in the county, and which was owned by a man named Harlan Voss. Harlan Voss was wealthy and accustomed to getting what he wanted. What he currently wanted was the water rights to a creek that ran through 3 smaller farms on the south side of his range, and the farmers who held those rights were not interested in selling. Eva knew none of this at first. What she knew was that Dale Cutter had started appearing in town with increasing frequency, and that he watched her in a way that made the small hairs on her arms stand up. He was a big man, florid and loud, and he had twice now made remarks to her in the street that were not quite improper but were not quite proper either, and each time she had responded with the crisp, steady firmness that she deployed when a student needed to understand that a line had been crossed. It was Hattie Greer who told her the rest of it. One evening in early August, Hattie sat her down over coffee and explained that Harlan Voss had decided the most efficient way to pressure the farmers into selling was to make life in the county sufficiently unpleasant for people who stood in his way. There had been incidents at 2 of the farms. A barn fire that might have been accidental but probably was not. A horse that turned up lame after being in a corral that someone had apparently entered in the night. Nothing provable. Nothing that could be brought before the marshal in Cimarron City and turned into a charge. "And Jonas Morgan," Eva asked, her throat tightening. "What is his role in all of this?" Hattie set down her cup and looked at her with something carefully neutral in her expression. "That's the thing, Eva. Harlan Voss hired Jonas Morgan 2 months ago. That's why he's been staying out at the Callaway place, which Voss uses as a satellite. Some people in town think Morgan's the one who set the fires." Eva had walked home through the dark that night with her mind very quiet in the way that meant it was working very hard. The next day was a Saturday. Jonas came to her porch at his usual time, and Eva was sitting there, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes steady and cool. He stopped on the first step when he saw her face. "You know," he said, "about Harlan Voss." "Yes." He sat down on the step rather than in the chair he usually took, which put him lower than her, looking up. She thought that might have been deliberate. "I haven't set any fires," he said, "and I haven't hurt anyone. But you are working for a man who may have ordered those things." "Yes." "Why?" He looked out at the empty street. "Because he offered $300 for 2 months' work, and I thought it was a straightforward cattle operation job. It wasn't. I understood that about 3 weeks in. And you stayed. I needed the money." He stopped. Then, with the honesty that she had come to understand was one of the most fundamental things about him, he said, "No. That's not the whole truth. I stayed because I thought I could manage what Voss was doing. Moderate it. Keep it from going too far. That was a mistake in judgment. Have you been moderating it? I've refused 3 direct orders, he said. Voss doesn't know they were direct refusals. I made them look like failures of opportunity. But he's starting to be suspicious, and when he figures it out, it won't go well. Eva looked at him for a long time. Those farmers have children, she said. 3 of those children are in my school. I know that. So what are you going to do? He met her gaze. I've been trying to work that out. She had not told him to leave. She had not told him she did not want to see him anymore. What she had done was make it clear. In the particular quiet and precise way she communicated important things, that this was not something she could look past without resolution, that the shape of the man she had been coming to know and the shape of the man who worked for Harlan Voss were 2 incompatible things, and that the space between them could not be navigated with anything less than complete honesty. He had nodded and walked back into the heat of the afternoon, and she had watched him go with an ache in her chest that she refused to call by its true name. In August, the situation worsened. Harlan Voss, apparently deciding that moderate pressure was taking too long, escalated. A man named Pedro Salazar, one of the 3 farmers with water rights, came to Eva one morning before school with his hat in his hands and his face taut with fear. 2 men had ridden to his farm at night and told him and his family they had 1 week to either sell or leave. His wife and 2 daughters, aged 7 and 9, both of whom attended Eva's school, were in a state of terror. Eva had gone that evening to the Copper Spur Saloon for the first time in her life, which created considerable stir, and had asked the barman where she could find Jonas Morgan. She was told he was in a back room playing cards. She had walked back there without being invited and pushed open the door. Jonas had looked up from his cards. 3 other men at the table looked at her with varying degrees of surprise and offense. "I need to speak with you," Eva said. He had folded his hand and followed her out. She told him about Pedro Salazar. She told him everything Salazar had said in precise, measured tones, standing in the alley behind the saloon while the noise of the evening poured around them. She watched Jonas's face as she spoke. She watched the way his jaw set and the way his eyes went somewhere distant and cold and the way his hands hanging loose at his sides slowly curled into fists. When she finished, he said, "How frightened is Salazar?" Profoundly. "His wife wants to leave immediately. He doesn't want to abandon land his father worked. He's torn apart by it." "Those children in your school," Jonas said, "they're all right." "They're frightened," Eva said. "Children know when their world is unsafe. It's showing in their learning." He was quiet for a long time. The sounds of the saloon came through the walls. A horse moved in the stable nearby. The night was warm and very still. "I'm going to end this," he said, "with Voss. I'm going to end my arrangement with him and make it clear to him that the intimidation stops. And if he doesn't stop, then I'll go to the marshal. The marshal is 60 miles away. By the time he can respond, a great deal can happen." "I know," Jonas said, "but I have a plan." He paused. "Trust me." She looked at him in the dim light of the alley. This man she had not trusted with anything significant and was being asked to trust with the safety of families she cared about. And she found, to her own amazement, that she did trust him. Not blindly, not without apprehension, but with the solid, factual certainty that this man's word, when he gave it, was not given carelessly. "All right," she said. She went home. She did not sleep much. What Jonas did, she learned later and in stages, was methodical and very Jonas Morgan in its approach. He went to Harlan Voss the following morning and resigned his position, citing irreconcilable differences in the methods he was being asked to employ. Voss, as Jonas had anticipated, did not take this with equanimity. There was a confrontation at the Rocking H Ranch that Jonas described to Eva later, with a brevity that told her it had been considerably more dangerous than he was letting on. At the end of it, Jonas had made several things clear to Voss, including the existence of documentation he had been quietly compiling of Voss's activities, which Jonas had sent in a sealed letter to the marshal's office in Cimarron City before riding out to the ranch. Voss was furious. But Voss was also, at his core, a man who prioritized self-interest, and Jonas Morgan's reputation in this part of Texas was such that there was a calculus being performed in Harlan Voss's mind about whether the satisfaction of retribution was worth what it would cost. Jonas had also, quietly, spoken to each of the 3 farmers with water rights and helped them understand their legal position, the letters they should send to the county office, and the records they should keep. He had done all of this without advertising it, without asking for recognition, moving through it with the efficiency of a man who has spent years thinking several moves ahead. Dale Cutter had appeared in town once more after Jonas left the Rocking H, and had ridden past Eva's schoolhouse at an hour when he knew she would be inside with her students. He had not stopped. He had simply looked at the building, and Eva, watching from the window, had felt a cold thread of something that she would not call fear work down her spine. She had told Jonas that evening. Jonas had gone very still in his particular way. Then he had said, "I want to be honest with you about something. Please. I have made a significant number of enemies in my life. Some of them have long memories. And Voss still has men working for him who would not lose sleep over doing something he'd want done, even without a direct order." He looked at her steadily. "Being seen as significant to me makes you a possible point of pressure. I don't think it's reached that level. But I want you to know that it's a consideration." Eva absorbed this. "Are you telling me to distance myself from you? I'm giving you the information and leaving the decision to you." She looked at him for a long time. The evening light was amber through the window of her small house, and it caught the silver that was just beginning to thread itself through the dark of his hair at the temples, and she thought about all the reasons this was complicated and all the reasons it was not, and she made a decision. "I don't make a habit," she said slowly, "of moving away from things because they are complicated or because there is risk involved. If that were my nature, I would not have come to this town, and I would not have befriended a man whose name makes respectable women cross the street." She paused. "I'm not crossing the street, Jonas." Something happened in his face that she had never seen there before. It moved through his eyes and settled into the lines around his mouth, and it was so unguarded and so nakedly grateful that it made her chest ache. "Eva," he said quietly. "Do not make it a larger moment than it is," she said, because she was afraid that if he said the right thing she would cry, and she had not cried in 2 years, and she was not going to start in front of him. "It's simply a statement of my position." "Of course," he said, and the corner of his mouth curved upward and she looked away. September arrived, and with it, a change in the quality of everything. The heat broke partially, enough that the evenings were something approaching comfortable, and the light shifted from white-hot to something softer and more gold. Eva's students were more settled. The situation with Harlan Voss had not entirely resolved. The marshal in Cimarron City was investigating but had not yet acted, but the direct intimidation had stopped. Pedro Salazar's family remained at their farm. Their daughters came to school with somewhat brighter faces than they had worn in August. And Jonas was no longer employed by anyone, which meant his time was his own, which meant that the Saturday afternoons on Eva's porch extended into evenings, and the conversations grew longer and deeper and more honestly intimate than anything Eva had experienced in years. He brought her a book one Saturday in early September, a novel, George Eliot's Middlemarch, which had been published a decade earlier and which Eva had never read. He had clearly read it himself. She could see where the spine was worn. "It seemed like something you would appreciate," he said, handing it to her with a casualness that was almost studied in its understatement. She looked at the title, looked at him, and said, "You're giving me a novel about a woman who is too intelligent for the world she lives in and the limitations it tries to place on her." "I did not say that. You did not have to." He smiled then, fully, which he did rarely enough that it still caught her off guard every time. It transformed his face entirely, dissolving the controlled, watchful quality that was its resting state and leaving something younger and more open. "Just read it," he said. She read it in 4 evenings. On the 5th, she told him everything she thought about it, at length and with intensity, and he argued back with her about 2 of her assessments, and they sat on her porch in the cool September dark arguing about a novel written by an Englishwoman who was born when their grandparents were young, and Eva thought that this was the finest evening she had spent in Redemption, and possibly in several years before it. Afterward, when the argument had wound down to a contented quiet, Jonas said, "I've been thinking about staying." Eva kept her voice perfectly neutral. "In Redemption, yes." "In what capacity?" He shifted in his chair. This was one of the very few times she had seen him look uncertain. "That's the part I'm still working out. I have some money saved. Not a great amount, but some. Enough to start something small. There's a property for sale at the north end of town." He paused. "Doc Hennessy has been talking about needing someone to help organize his records and do some of the routine work that doesn't require full medical training. He's 70 years old and his eyes are going." Eva looked at him in the darkness. "You would work for the town doctor. I know more about medicine than most people in this county who haven't been to medical school. I've had to, in my line of work. And I'm good at organizing information. And you would buy the property at the north end of town. If it works out." "Jonas," she waited until he looked at her fully. "Why are you telling me this?" He held her gaze. "Because I want to know if it matters to you, what I do, where I stay." The question was so direct and so unadorned by any rhetorical decoration that it left her nowhere to hide, which was, she suspected, entirely intentional. "Yes," she said, "it matters to me." The silence that settled between them then was not awkward. It was the silence of 2 people who have understood something important simultaneously and are giving it the room it deserves. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. She looked down at their joined hands, his large and scarred, her small with ink on the index finger from marking papers, and she did not pull away. She turned her hand so that her fingers curled around his, and they sat like that in the September dark while the stars came out over Redemption, Texas, and the town breathed quietly around them. It was in that week, the week after, that the thing with Dale Cutter came to its head. Cutter had not been seen in town for 3 weeks, long enough that Eva had allowed herself to believe the matter was concluded. She was wrong. On a Wednesday afternoon, she dismissed her students at the usual hour and stayed behind to organize the following day's lessons. She was at her desk when the door opened, and it was not Jonas, and it was not a student, and it was not anyone she would have chosen to be alone with in a building at the far end of town. Dale Cutter was not a subtle man. He did not pretend to be there for any reason other than the reason he was there, which was to communicate, clearly, and with an underlying current of menace that filled the small schoolroom like smoke, that Harlan Voss was not finished with the water rights dispute, that the marshal's investigation was a nuisance but not a resolution, and that Eva's friendship with Jonas Morgan had made her an item of interest. "You tell your friend Morgan," Cutter said, standing in the middle of the schoolroom with his hat on and his thumbs in his belt, "that Mr. Voss's patience is considerable but not unlimited. The farmers are going to sell eventually. It's just a question of what it costs everyone in the meantime." Eva stood behind her desk. She was afraid. She was clear-eyed about that. The fear was sitting in her chest like a cold stone, and her hands were flat on the desk surface to keep them steady. But she had learned something important about herself in 26 years of living, which was that fear did not prevent her from thinking clearly. "Mr. Cutter," she said, "you are in a schoolroom. Whatever message you imagine you are delivering it in a building where children learn. I would like you to consider what that says about the kind of man you are, and then I would like you to leave." Cutter stared at her for a moment. Then he laughed, but it was not an entirely comfortable laugh. There was something in Eva Ford's expression that was genuinely difficult to stare down, a quality of absolute moral clarity that made people feel, however briefly, the weight of their own inadequacy. He left, but he lingered in the doorway long enough to make clear that it was his choice and not hers. Eva sat down at her desk and breathed very carefully for 2 minutes. Then she gathered her things, locked the schoolhouse, and went to find Jonas. She found him at Doc Hennessy's office, as she had thought she might. He was reorganizing a cabinet of medical records when she came through the door. He took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him. She told him every word of it, and she was composed until about halfway through, when she felt the composure begin to slip, not from fear but from the relief of telling someone, and she caught herself and pulled it back. When she finished, Jonas was very quiet for what felt like a long time but was probably 30 seconds. "You were alone in the schoolhouse with Cutter," he said. "Yes. He threatened you. He implied." He was careful about the wording. Jonas turned and put both hands flat on the cabinet and stood there with his back to her, and she could see the set of his shoulders, the rigid control he was maintaining. "Jonas," she said quietly, "I need you to think carefully about what you do next." He turned around. His face was controlled, but his eyes were not. "He cannot come within 100 yards of you again," he said. "I agree. But there is a right way to accomplish that and a wrong way, and I am asking you clearly and directly to choose the right way." "The right way. Go to the marshal. You already have documentation. Add this incident. Do it properly through the law." She held his gaze. "You told me you were done with the life you had led. I need you to show me what that means in a moment when the other option is tempting." He looked at her for a long time. She could see the struggle in him, the old instincts and the new intentions pulling at each other, and she did not look away because she understood that what happened in this moment was important not just for the immediate situation but for everything that came after it. "The right way," he said again, more quietly this time. "Yes." He took a long, slow breath. He straightened. He picked up his hat from the chair beside the cabinet. "I'll go to the marshal's office tomorrow and send a wire. And I'll speak to Tom Harding, the town's constable, tonight about Cutter. Get it on record locally." He paused. "And I'm going to speak to Pedro Salazar and the other 2 farmers about organizing a formal complaint. Collectively it carries more weight." Eva let out a breath she had been holding. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right." He crossed to where she was standing and stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the exact texture of the worry in his face, the care that was there for her safety, unguarded and real. "I don't like that he frightened you," Jonas said. "I was frightened," she admitted, "but I managed it." "I know you did. That's not the point." He reached out and very gently touched her face, just his fingers against her cheek for a moment, and Eva felt the warmth of it spread through her entire body. "You shouldn't have to manage it." "No," she agreed. "I should not, and we are going to make sure that I don't have to again, through the proper channels." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "You are the most relentlessly principled woman I have ever met." "Is that a complaint?" "It's an observation." He let his hand fall. "And no, it is not a complaint." Jonas went to Constable Harding that evening. He sent the wire to Cimarron City the following morning. He spoke to all 3 farmers. He was methodical and thorough and entirely within the bounds of the law, and Eva watched him do all of it with something growing in her chest that she was no longer pretending she could not name. The marshal arrived in Redemption 11 days later, a man named Carver, lean and weathered and apparently very thorough. He interviewed Eva, Jonas, Pedro Salazar, and the other farmers over 2 days. He interviewed Constable Harding. He reviewed Jonas's documentation. He then rode out to the Rocking H Ranch. And what happened in that meeting between Marshal Carver and Harlan Voss was not entirely clear to the people of Redemption, but the outcome was clear enough. Voss signed an agreement that the 3 farmers' water rights would not be contested. Dale Cutter was removed from the county under the marshal's supervision. 2 other men from the Rocking H who had participated in the nighttime visits were arrested and taken to Cimarron City to face charges. The crisis, or this particular crisis, was over. Eva stood at the window of her schoolhouse the morning after Marshal Carver rode out, watching the town go about its ordinary business in the early October light, and she felt something in her shoulders that she had not realized had been braced for months slowly, carefully release. October moved forward in the golden, gentle way of Texas autumn. Jonas bought the property at the north end of town, a small lot with a wooden building that needed significant work but had good bones, and spent his afternoons and evenings working on it while his mornings were given to Doc Hennessy's office. The sound of hammering became a feature of Eva's evenings, drifting across the quiet air from the north end of town, and she found it an oddly reassuring sound. He came to Sunday services with her, which created a flutter of observation among the congregation that Eva met with her usual composure and Jonas met with a blank-faced indifference that she found quietly amusing. Hattie Greer pulled Eva aside after services one Sunday and said, with absolute sincerity and no judgment, "He looks at you like you are the only fixed point in his sky. I have lived 61 years and I have seen a small number of men look at women that way, and I want you to know that it is not a common thing." Eva had thanked her and said nothing, but she had thought about those words for several days. The night she understood fully what she felt, without qualification or reservation, was a Thursday in late October. There had been a bad storm, unusual for the season, a hard driving rain that flooded the street, brought down a section of fence at the livery stable, and caused a tree at the edge of the Salazar farm to topple across a portion of their small barn. Eva heard about it early and went to help, as several other townspeople did. They spent the morning clearing debris and making temporary repairs. It was hard, muddy, physical work, and Eva arrived home in the early afternoon soaked through and exhausted. Jonas had shown up at her door half an hour later, also muddy, having spent the morning at the same farm. He had a cloth-wrapped pot in his hands. "Hattie sent soup," he said, "and I added to it. I know how to cook." She had let him in, changed into dry clothes behind the curtained partition of her small house, and they had sat at her kitchen table eating soup and talking about the storm and the farm and the necessary repairs and half a dozen other things. And at some point the conversation had moved away from practical concerns and into something quieter and more personal, and Jonas had said, almost without preamble, "I wrote to Cora." "To your sister?" "Yes. I told her I had stopped. I told her I was working for a doctor and I had bought a property and I was not carrying guns professionally anymore." He paused. "I told her about you." Eva set down her spoon. "What did you tell her?" "That I had met a woman who was the kind of person I did not know existed anymore. The kind who is honestly good, not performing goodness. Who is intelligent without being cruel about it. Who is brave in a way that doesn't look like anything dramatic from the outside but is there in everything she does." He was looking at the table, and then he looked up and met her eyes directly. "I told her that if I was ever going to be the kind of man worth knowing, it became possible to see what that looked like because of Eva Ford." The rain was still tapping quietly at the window. The soup was warm between their hands. "Jonas," Eva said, "you don't have to say anything. I want to say something." She took a breath. "I came to this town with my life in pieces. I came here with nothing I had planned on and nowhere I had expected to be, and I have spent the last several months building something that is genuinely mine. My work, my students, my place here." She looked at him steadily. "And somewhere inside all of that, without any intention on my part, and with a good deal of initial resistance, you have become the most significant part of how I understand my life in redemption. I have tried to be sensible about it and I have not entirely succeeded." Jonas was very still. "I love you," Eva said, because she was not a woman who dressed difficult truths in comfortable language. "I did not plan for it, and I am not entirely comfortable with how significant it has become, but those are both my problems to manage and not reasons to say anything other than the true thing." Jonas reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "I love you too," he said. "I have for longer than I should probably admit." She looked at him, at this complicated, scarred, quietly extraordinary man who had walked into her world with guns on his hips and Dickens in his head, and had proceeded, with apparent ease and absolutely no regard for her attempts at sensible detachment, to make himself essential to her, and she felt the last of the careful distance she had maintained dissolve entirely. He leaned across the table and kissed her gently, with a restraint and a tenderness that said everything she needed to know about the kind of man he was choosing, very deliberately, to be. November brought a letter from Jonas's sister Cora, and he brought it to Eva on a Saturday morning, reading her sections of it with a smile she had never seen on him before, something purely unguarded and happy. Cora Morgan wrote with warmth and sharp wit and considerable feeling. She wrote that she had prayed daily for years for exactly this kind of letter, and had begun to suspect God was deliberately testing her patience. She wrote that she would like very much to meet the woman who had apparently provided her brother with a reason to hang up his duster and become a useful member of society. She wrote 3 pages, which Jonas read with the expression of a man who has been cold for a very long time and has finally stepped into a warm room. She wants to visit in the spring, Jonas said. I would like that, Eva said, and she meant it. December was cold and bright and extraordinarily beautiful in the way of West Texas winters, the sky a hard, clear blue that went on forever and the light sharp and clean on the dry grass. Eva's students put on a small Christmas pageant that she organized with considerable logistical effort and considerable help from several of the parents, including, to the collective mild surprise of redemption, Jonas Morgan, who spent an afternoon building a simple wooden set piece for the performance, and who was subsequently the subject of much quiet reassessment by the town's adults. Christmas Eve brought Jonas to Eva's door with a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a pocket journal, leather-bound, with her initials pressed into the cover. "For your thoughts," he said. "You are always thinking things you don't say. I thought you might like somewhere to put them." She had prepared something for him as well, a letter. Not a short letter. A very long one, several pages, in which she had written to him everything about her life that she had not yet found the words to say aloud. About her father, about grief, about the particular loneliness of being a woman of intelligence in a world that often found such women inconvenient, about what it had meant to come to redemption and find, against all expectation, something she had not known to look for. He read it at her table while she made tea, and when she set the cup in front of him, she saw that his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before. He did not say anything. He reached up and caught her hand and pressed it briefly to his face, and she understood everything he meant by it. January was quiet and intimate in the way of the period after something important has been resolved. Jonas's property was taking shape, the building repaired and weatherproofed, the interior fitted with what it needed to be livable. He would not be moving into it until they were married, which was a convention both of them respected without having to discuss it at length. They both understood that this was the direction they were going. The conversation about it was practical rather than dramatic, happening one afternoon in the half-finished building while Jonas was fitting a new window frame and Eva was sitting on a sawhorse observing and contributing suggestions. "Spring," Jonas said. "What about spring? To get married. Cora would be here by then. Your students would know you and respect the relationship." Eva considered this with the gravity it deserved. "The end of April," she said. "When the weather is reliable and the worst of the calving season is over so the farmers can attend." He turned from the window frame and looked at her. "You've already thought about this." "I am an organized person," she said serenely. He laughed, and the sound of it filled the half-built room, and Eva thought she would rather hear that sound for the rest of her life than almost anything she could imagine. February was when the past arrived, as it has a tendency to do in stories like this one. His name was Rex Calder, and he rode into redemption on a Tuesday morning in February on a horse that had been ridden hard, and with a look on his face that Constable Harding recognized from long experience as the look of a man carrying unresolved business. Calder was a bounty hunter, approximately Jonas's age, 40 or thereabouts, rough-edged and watchful, and he was looking for Jonas Morgan. He found Jonas at Doc Hennessy's office, and he came inside without knocking, which established the tone fairly efficiently. Eva was not there when this happened, but Jonas told her about it that evening, carefully and completely, because he had committed himself to that kind of transparency, and he did not waver from it. Rex Calder had come with a proposition. There was a man in New Mexico, a man named Luther Bain, who had warrants out for enough crimes to make his capture worth $800. Calder wanted a partner for the job. He wanted Jonas specifically because Jonas knew Bain's habits and Bain's territory from the New Mexico Range War period. $800, Eva said quietly. Yes. And what did you say? I said no. She looked at him. He met her eyes without wavering. It took me about 4 seconds to say it, he said. Calder was not pleased. He made several arguments, good ones by the logic of the life I used to lead. Money, professional obligation, history. He paused. And then he made one argument that was not good, which was that a man like me would get bored eventually and come back to it, and I ought to do it on my own terms before I found myself going back on worse terms. That was intended to provoke you. Yes, it did not succeed. Because, he looked at her with that quiet, clear directness. Because I have something worth protecting now, and going back into that life is incompatible with protecting it. Those two things cannot coexist, and I am not uncertain about which one I choose. Eva sat with this for a moment. Then she said, Did Calder leave? He left this morning. He was irritated but not dangerous. He's not an enemy. Jonas paused. There are a couple of names in my past who might be a different matter, men who have reason to hold grievances. I want to be honest with you about that. It is possible, not certain, but possible, that in the years to come there are people from that period who might look me up. And when that happens, Eva asked, I deal with it as it comes. Through the law where the law is sufficient. By other means if it is not, but with as little violence as can be managed. He looked at her steadily. I am not going to pretend I am a different man than I am. My past is the past and not the present, but it is still mine. I know, Eva said. I have never asked you to be someone other than who you are. I fell in love with the man you actually are, not with an edited version. Jonas looked at her in a way that made her think he was still, at some deep level, surprised by her, still adjusting to the reality of being known without being diminished by the knowing. Cora is going to love you, he said, unreservedly and immediately. I expect we will get along very well, Eva agreed. March brought the first real warmth, and Cora Morgan arrived on the stage from Abilene on the 12th of the month, which fell on a Sunday. She was 2 years younger than Jonas, round-faced and dark-eyed like him, but with a ready warmth in her expression that he had always held more carefully in reserve. She had her husband Frank's last name now, Cora Whitfield, and she came with a carpetbag and an immediate, thorough evaluation of everything, and everyone that she conducted with great efficiency over the first 24 hours. Her assessment of Eva, delivered to Jonas privately but reported to Eva afterward by Jonas himself with evident satisfaction, was as follows. She's genuine. That matters more than anything. She doesn't perform at being good, she just is. And she's going to handle you better than anyone has any right to expect. Eva and Cora had spent 2 days together before Cora sat across from Eva at Hattie Greer's kitchen table and said, very directly, I need to thank you. You don't, Eva said. I do. Cora's eyes were bright. For 12 years I wrote him letters and I prayed, and I hoped he would stop before something terrible ended it for him. I watched him from a distance get harder and more isolated, and I could not get through to him because the distance was too great. And then she made a small gesture with her hands. You just showed up in this town and were exactly who you are, and apparently that was the thing that nothing else had been. Eva looked at her hands around her coffee cup. He did the work himself, she said quietly. I was simply a reason to do it. The actual work was entirely his. Cora shook her head slightly. You are both going to be impossible in the best possible way, she said, and she sounded entirely happy about it. April arrived, and with it all the preparations that Eva had organized with her characteristic thoroughness. The wedding was to be held on the 26th, at the church, conducted by Reverend Parsons, who had gone from initial deep skepticism about Jonas Morgan to a cautious respect over the preceding months, as he watched the man work quietly alongside Doc Hennessy and participate in the ongoing reconstruction of a section of the church's foundation that had been compromised by the October rains. The day before the wedding, Eva sat at her table in the early evening and wrote in her leather journal, the one Jonas had given her at Christmas. She wrote about the shape of her life before redemption and the shape of it now, and the distance between those two shapes that had been crossed not in any single dramatic moment, but in a long accumulation of ordinary moments. Conversations on a porch, a coyote pup in the failing light, soup across a kitchen table during a rainstorm, a letter read at Christmas, a man choosing the right path over the easy one in every moment she had watched him choose. She wrote, "I came here to teach children, and instead I learned something myself, which is that the life a person builds in the aftermath of loss can be more entirely one's own than the life one is handed at the beginning. I am more myself here than I have ever been anywhere, and the man I am going to marry tomorrow is more himself with me than he has been, I believe, in most of his adult life. That is a profound and humbling and extraordinary thing." She closed the journal and went to bed and slept very well. The 26th of April, 1883, was warm and clear, with a sky that was the particular deep blue of a Texas spring morning. Eva dressed in the room Hattie had given her for the preparation, with Cora and Hattie both present, Hattie fighting a losing battle with her own emotions, and Cora keeping things practical and warm. Eva wore a dress of ivory-colored cotton that she had made with help from two of the church women, simple and well-fitted, with small buttons up the bodice, and a high collar that she found elegant without being fussy. When she came through the church door and saw Jonas standing at the front of the room waiting for her, she understood several things simultaneously. She understood that he had pressed his suit and cut his hair and was cleaner and more carefully presented than she had ever seen him, and that he was wearing the suit with a slight awkwardness that told her he had not worn formal clothes in a very long time, and that none of this mattered in the slightest compared to the expression on his face when he saw her come through the door, which was an expression of such complete and transparent happiness that the entire congregation seemed to breathe inward at the sight of it. She walked to him and he took her hands, and his hands were steady and warm. Reverend Parsons said the words. They said their words back. Jonas's voice was quiet and entirely certain, and Eva's was the same. When it was done and the Reverend announced it to the small congregation of the people who had become their community, there was a warm, genuine sound of celebration that felt, to Eva, like exactly the right thing. Jonas kissed her with the same gentle restraint she had known from him since October, and which told her, every single time, more than the kiss itself. Afterward, at the wedding supper that Hattie organized in the church hall with contributions from most of the town, Pedro Salazar shook Jonas's hand and said something in Spanish that Jonas answered in Spanish, and Eva looked at him with fresh surprise. "You speak Spanish," she said later. "I do," he said. "Several of the families I worked with in New Mexico were Spanish-speaking. I learned enough to be useful, and then it became something I kept up." She shook her head slightly. The layers of this man continued to reveal themselves, and she suspected they would not stop. Cora gave a small speech that made 3 people cry. Hattie gave a longer one that made 6 people cry. Jonas said, simply and directly, that he was grateful, and that was all. And everyone understood that for a man who had spent years keeping his most important things invisible, saying anything in public was a significant act. They moved into the North End property together in May, the building now fully finished and very much reflecting the combined intelligence of 2 people who knew what they wanted from a space. Eva's books occupied 2 shelves in the front room. Jonas's medical texts from Doc Hennessy occupied another. There was a kitchen with a good stove and a yard where Eva planted a kitchen garden in May with seeds she ordered from a catalog. There was a room for Cora when she visited. Eva continued teaching. Jonas continued at Doc Hennessy's. They built what they built the way all lasting things are built, without fanfare and with a great deal of steadily applied effort and care. In July of 1883, Eva told Jonas she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, on a morning, matter-of-factly, because that was her way with important things, and she watched him go absolutely still, and then watched his face do something she had never entirely seen before, a kind of overwhelmed, unguarded wonder that moved through him visibly. He crossed the kitchen and took her face very gently in both his hands and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "Are you well?" He said. "Are you feeling well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "Doc Hennessy should examine you." "Yes, I planned for that. I've already spoken with him." He let out a long breath. His eyes were very bright. "A child," he said. "Yes," she said, "our child." He pulled her into his arms with a tenderness that was so complete and so careful that she felt herself entirely held by it. And she rested her face against his chest, and felt the warmth of him around her, and thought about the distance between the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in Redemption 15 months ago with her life in pieces, and the woman she was now, held in the arms of this man in the kitchen of their house, carrying their first child. And the distance was so vast, and so filled with everything she had not expected that she could not contain it in any single thought. She cried briefly. He held her and did not comment, which was exactly right. The pregnancy went well. Doc Hennessy monitored it with the thoroughness of a man who had been practicing medicine for 40 years, and who had developed a particular fondness for both Jonas and Eva that he expressed through professional diligence rather than sentiment. The town women organized themselves around Eva in the way of communities that have decided to claim someone fully, bringing food and advice and company through the hotter months. Jonas was attentive without being overbearing, which was a balance Eva deeply appreciated. He was up early and came home reliably. He made sure the kitchen was stocked. He read to her in the evenings when she was tired, sometimes from her novels and sometimes from medical texts in a way that made her laugh at the juxtaposition. He wrote to Cora weekly, and Cora's responses were full of practical advice and joy. He also, without making an event of it, went to Reverend Parsons and asked about teaching the older boys in town a basic literacy class on Saturday mornings, for those who had passed schooling age but who had had limited access to it. Parsons arranged the use of the church hall. Jonas began teaching 9 students of ages ranging from 14 to 23, cowboys and farm hands, and the son of the blacksmith who had never been taught to read properly. He taught them with patience and without condescension, and Eva heard reports of it from multiple sources, all saying variations of the same thing, that Jonas Morgan was remarkably good at it. She was not surprised. She had known this about him since October. In March of 1884, their son was born. Jonas was present throughout, holding her hand and being exactly what she needed without being told, which she would have expected from no other man she had ever known. The birth was hard but not dangerous. Doc Hennessy managed it with steady competence and considerable relief when it was over. They named the boy Samuel Henry Morgan. Samuel for Eva's father, whose first name had been Samuel Ford, and Henry for Jonas's father, the Methodist preacher from Missouri who had given him his first books. Cora arrived within 3 weeks of the birth and stayed for a month. She held Samuel with the practiced ease of a woman with 3 children of her own, and she wept openly at his face and made Jonas cry too, though he did it very quietly and with his face turned away, which Eva pretended not to notice, but which she recorded in her journal that night with great tenderness. Samuel was a quiet, watchful baby who had his father's dark eyes and his mother's apparent determination, demonstrated early by the vigor with which he made his needs known. Eva wrote to the 2 friends she still had in Austin, women she had known since before the difficulties, and the letters she wrote describing her life would have been unrecognizable to the Eva who had boarded the stage south of Austin 2 years earlier, carrying the weight of lost things, looking for ground that would hold. The ground, it turned out, had been here all along. Time moved in the way that it does when a life is genuinely good, which is to say quickly, with each phase giving way to the next before one is entirely ready for it. Samuel was walking by the following winter and creating a form of structured chaos in the house on the north end of town that both his parents managed with different but complementary competencies. Eva's was organization. Jonas's was inexhaustible patience. Jonas's literacy class had expanded to 18 students by the spring of 1885. Several of the men he taught had continued on their own, borrowing books from Eva's shelves and returning them with careful, sometimes laborious written notes about what they had read, which Jonas brought home to show her, and which she read with the particular satisfaction of someone who understands what such notes represent. Doc Hennessy's eyesight had deteriorated to the point where he was effectively retired by the summer of 1885, and Jonas took over the management of the medical practice in a capacity that stretched the definition of his role considerably. He was not a doctor, was clear about this, and referred anything beyond his training appropriately to the nearest qualified physician in Cimarron City. What he provided was practical care, wound management, setting of bones, dispensing of medicines, basic diagnosis, and a calm, knowledgeable presence that the town trusted. Several people wrote to the county to ask about the possibility of Jonas pursuing formal medical credentials, and the letters that came back were encouraging. "You should consider it," Eva told him on an evening in September of that year. Samuel was asleep. The house was quiet. She was marking papers at the table and he was reading one of Hennessy's medical texts, which he did most evenings. "A medical education takes years," he said. "Not entirely through formal schooling in this era," she said. "There are correspondence programs, apprenticeship qualifications. It would take time, but you already have most of the practical foundation." She looked at him across the table. "You are already doing the work, Jonas. The credentials would simply make it official." He considered this with the serious, unhurried way he considered all important things. "It would be expensive. We are not without savings. It would require travel at some point. A period of examination somewhere. We would manage that." He looked at her. "You've already thought through the logistics." "I'm an organized person," she said, which was what she had said when they were planning their wedding and which made him smile exactly as it had then. "Yes," he said. "All right, let's pursue it." By the autumn of 1886, Jonas had enrolled in a correspondence program with a medical college in St. Louis that, combined with his documented practical experience and Hennessy's formal endorsement, placed him on a path toward legitimate credentialing. It took 2 more years and a 3-week period in St. Louis for examinations that Eva managed at home with Samuel, now 3, and very much a full person with opinions. Jonas came back from St. Louis with a letter of qualification that he held with the same careful hands he had used to hold Cora's worn letters in his duster pocket all those years ago. He was Dr. Jonas Morgan. He stood in their kitchen with this letter, and looked at Eva with an expression she could not describe, except to say that it was a man looking at the shape of the life that had replaced the one he had been living, and finding it almost unbearably good. She took the letter from him and read it and set it carefully on the table and embraced him, her arms around him, her face against the front of his shirt. "Samuel," he called over her head, "come here." Samuel appeared in the doorway, dark-eyed and serious, 3 years old and already carrying himself like someone who was paying close attention. "What is it?" Samuel said. "Your father is a doctor," Jonas said. "Come and see." Samuel came forward and examined the letter with the solemnity of a person who could not yet read, but understood the gravity of important documents and was determined not to be left out of significant moments. "Is that good?" Samuel asked. "Yes," Eva said, still against Jonas's shirt. "It is very, very good." In 1888, their second child was born, a girl this time. They named her Clara, and she arrived with a tremendous amount of energy and red in her face that made Jonas laugh immediately, which was his way of expressing that he was overwhelmed with relief that both mother and child were well. Clara grew into the kind of child who charmed everyone within a 10-foot radius, and who absolutely knew it and deployed this knowledge without restraint. Samuel regarded his sister with the mixture of affection and beleaguerment that is entirely universal to older siblings, and which his parents observed with great entertainment. The town of Redemption had changed over the years in the way that towns do when they are inhabited by people who care about them. There was a proper medical clinic now, established in a larger building than Doc Hennessy's original office, and Jonas ran it with 2 assistant helpers he had trained. The school had grown. Eva had added a second teacher, a young woman named Martha who had come from San Antonio, and who reminded Eva, with a pang of recognition, of herself as she had arrived here 7 years earlier. 2 trunks and a teaching certificate and a quiet grief, and nowhere she expected to be. Eva had taken Martha under her wing with all the warmth she had to give, and Martha had become part of the fabric of their lives, often at their dinner table, often in their yard on summer evenings, another person to love. Eva still taught. She would always teach. Her students now ranged from children whose parents had been children in her first class, second-generation students in a town that had grown around their roots. She was 34 years old, and she was exactly who she had meant to be, which was a thing she had not been certain she would ever say. Jonas's past came knocking one final time, in the autumn of 1889. A man appeared in Redemption looking for Jonas Morgan the hired gun, having not heard, apparently, of Jonas Morgan the doctor. The man had an old grievance from the New Mexico period, and had been nursing it for 7 years. He was not a rational man, and he was not a safe one, and what happened was that Constable Harding, now quite experienced in the management of such situations and possessed of a deputy, handled it without requiring Jonas to intervene at all. The man was disarmed, arrested, and transported to Cimarron City, where he was found to have multiple warrants already outstanding and was effectively removed from the board. Jonas told Eva about it that evening with a thoroughness that she appreciated, and she told him her honest reaction, which was that she was grateful and also that she had been watching his face through the whole account, and she could see that he had genuinely not been tempted by the old instincts, and that this mattered to her. "It was not even a close decision," Jonas said. "I am a physician in this town. I have a wife and 2 children. I have a life that has more value and more meaning than anything I could have imagined in the years I spent doing what I used to do. There is nothing to weigh against that." "I know," Eva said. "I simply wanted to hear you say it." He looked at her with that expression she had loved since the night they first acknowledged it, the one that told her she was the fixed point of his sky, and he said, "I will say it as many times and as often as you need." Christmas of 1889 was the finest Christmas Eva had experienced since childhood. Cora and her family came from Kansas, Frank and their 3 children filling the house with a beautiful, rambunctious noise that Samuel regarded with the careful attention of a diplomatic observer, and Clara dove into with immediate, ecstatic enthusiasm. Jonas cooked the Christmas dinner himself, which he was very good at, and Cora sat in the kitchen with Eva drinking coffee and talking with the ease of women who have become true sisters in the way that matters, the way built of shared years and genuine knowing. On Christmas evening, after the children were in bed and Cora's family were settled in the guest room, and the room that had been hastily converted for the occasion, Eva and Jonas sat in front of the small fireplace in their front room, the room with all the books. Eva was leaning against his shoulder and his arm was around her and the fire was low and warm. "Are you happy?" Jonas asked. It was a simple question asked simply, and she considered it with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said. "In the complete factual sense of the word, I am happy." She paused. "Are you?" "Beyond anything I knew how to want," he said. "When I was 20 years old, I could not have pictured this. I did not have the reference points for it. And now," he pressed his lips to her hair, "now I cannot imagine wanting anything more than exactly this." She took his hand and held it in both of hers, the scarred knuckles and the warmth of him, and the fire settled, and the house breathed around them with its sleeping children, and its rooms of books, and the quiet certainty of a life built well. The years continue to be kind, which they are, to people who build things with care and honesty and love. Samuel grew into a young man who had his father's dark eyes and his mother's precise mind, and who announced at the age of 14 that he intended to be a physician, which was not a surprise to anyone, and which Jonas met with the quiet pride of a man who had never imagined he would have anything to give a child, and has discovered that he has a great deal. Clara grew into a young woman of considerable force of personality, who at the age of 12 was already teaching other children things in the yard without being asked, which Eva observed from the kitchen window one afternoon with a smile that had tears in it, though she did not fully examine why. Redemption continued to be, in the way of small towns that are genuinely communities, the sum of the people who inhabited it. People came and went. The railroad came closer, though not all the way. The county grew. The law settled. The wildness of the frontier, which had always been both freedom and danger, became something slightly more structured without entirely losing its character. And in 1892, 10 years after a woman with 2 trunks and a teaching certificate had stepped off a stagecoach into a sun-bleached cattle town and tried to make something from the rubble of an earlier life, and 9 years after a gunslinger had walked into her schoolhouse and said he was done with the life he had led, Eva Ford, who was now Eva Morgan, who was 36 years old and had laugh lines at the corners of her eyes and gray just beginning at her temples, and the best years of her life either behind her or ahead of her depending on how she counted them, had a third child, another boy. They named him Henry. Henry arrived in June in the summer heat, and was enormous and healthy, and immediately the object of Samuel's reserved but sincere approval, and Clara's absolutely unreserved and extremely loud approval. Jonas held his third child the way he had held the first, with those careful, scarred, gentle hands, and looked at Eva over the baby's head with everything he had ever needed to say, and never quite been able to find the words for expressed so fully in his face that words would have been redundant. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers against his jaw, her eyes telling him the same things back. Henry yawned. Samuel from the doorway, age 8, said with great practical interest, "He looks exactly like father." "He does rather," Eva agreed. "Is that good?" Samuel asked, which was exactly what he had asked about his father's medical letter 9 years ago with the same deliberate seriousness. "It is very, very good," Eva said, which was exactly what she had answered then. Jonas looked at her. She looked at him. In the warm June light, in the house on the north end of Redemption with its rooms full of books, and its kitchen garden in the yard and its children and its accumulated years of choosing well and choosing love, and choosing the harder and better path over the easier and emptier one. They looked at each other with the full knowledge of everything they were to each other, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything. He had walked into her schoolhouse and said he was done with the life he had led. What he had not known then, and what she had only gradually understood in the months and years that followed, was that he was not simply leaving something behind. He was arriving. Both of them were arriving from very different directions at the same place, which was here, this house, this town, this life, this family, this morning light and this evening quiet and this love that had built itself, one honest, ordinary, extraordinary day at a time, into something that neither of them would ever want to leave. And they never did.